Prepare to experience the strongest radio allowable by law. Secrets will be revealed. Myths dispelled. From the studio gym where excuses never apply, it's Superhuman Radio with your host, Carl Lenore.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Superhuman Radio. We're discussing a new study today that looks at the alcohol habits of your parents and may be why you seem to be addicted to certain types of foods, processed foods. This is fascinating, and it gives us a peek into both transgenerational epigenetic effects, as well as some evolutionary pressures that we'll discuss in the show in just a moment with my guest, Lindzey Hoover. Before we start, we have to thank our title sponsor, Legendary Foods, makers of the Tasty Pastry, which can actually help those people who crave crap processed foods, because the Tasty Pastry took what used to be the Pop-Tart and reimagined it. Less than 1 gram of sugar, 20 grams of high-quality protein, 4 to 5 net carbs. You'll eat them because they taste delicious, and at the same time, you'll realize that you're staying inside your dietary lane, and your kids will love them. There are very few healthy snacks that you could buy that your kids would love, and these fit that bill. So check them out. Go to shrnetwork.biz/legendary and use the code SHR10 to save 10% off, and let them know that you learned about them from the show. Check them out. Welcome to the show, Lindzey Hoover. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So you are with the University of Michigan. We should first say that to give credit to the appropriate institution. This study looks at whether or not your parents drank a lot, consumed a lot of alcohol, and its impact on you craving certain foods. Why this study? What indicated that this should be looked at? Why was this the next thing that fit into the research progression?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to start by saying what we mean when we're talking about highly processed food addiction. So we're talking about foods that don't occur naturally in nature, foods that are high in refined carbohydrates or fats. So we're thinking about those foods that we think of as traditional junk foods, like pizza, ice cream, French fries, cakes, those foods that we all think of as being highly rewarding and impacting our reward system similarly to other addictive substances is the kind of idea behind this concept. So a lot of research has been going, and there's growing evidence for the fact that these foods can be addictive in similar ways to other traditional substances. So thinking about food substances like alcohol or tobacco, that there's evidence that these foods can hit the reward system very similarly to these other substances, and that they can be associated with impulsivity, with emotion dysregulation, with reward sensitivity. So a lot of these underlying neural mechanisms that are implicated in traditional substance use disorders, we're finding are also implicated in the consumption of these highly processed foods. So part of the motivation for this project was really to think about, what do we know about these traditional substance use disorders? What do we know about the consumption of rewarding, addictive sort of substances? And what do we know are these most common or strongly known risk factors associated with risk of having an addiction to those substances, and see how they apply to these foods that we think may be highly addictive as well. So we know from the substance use literature that these foods risk factors tend to be co-occurrence with other addictive substances, problematic use of those other addictive substances. So that was one aim of the current project, was to look at, does food addiction co-occur with problematic use of alcohol, with problematic use of cannabis, tobacco, a lot of these common substances. And then the other component was to see in these individuals who have a parent with a history of problematic alcohol use, do they show an increased risk of an addictive-like consumption of these highly processed foods as well, because we know from the substance use disorder literature that a familial history of addiction or problematic use is one of our strongest risk factors for addiction to other substances in their offspring. So that's really where the motivation for this project came from, was to explore these similar risk factors that we know from the substance use literature.
And it makes perfect sense. We had limited things to be addicted to 100 years ago. And now we have, every day something new is coming out to satisfy the urges of human beings, to alter their mood, alter their state. In the food industry, it's well known that salt, fat, and sugar. And from an evolutionary perspective, those were very important. Finding, off the air, we talked about honey, but hunter-gatherers, they would find a huge honey complex, bees, and they would rip that stuff out and they would eat that because they knew it provided immediate energy. It was great for sustenance. Salt has always been sought after in history, as we know, throughout evolution. And fat, the most dense macronutrient there is. Eating fat could keep you alive for a very long period of time. So we have evolutionary imprints in our brain to seek these things out. And reward, the sensation for reward is just, hey, you did a good job. This is good. But now today, fast forward, we've got so many things that trigger our reward centers, and there's new ones every day. But also, if you look at alcohol, you look at kava. For a long time, people have used kava because it gave you that same kind of buzz feeling as alcohol. I mean, we have been abusing whatever we could get our hands on since the beginning of time.
Absolutely. And yeah, it makes so much sense, right? Back in the day, in order to get meat, you would have to go out with your bow or your sword or whatever weapon you had access to, and you'd have to physically exert all of this energy to hunt your meat, to cook it, to consume it, just to be able to get that little bit of nutrients. If you wanted to have honey, you had to go out, climb a tree, fight off the bees, get the honeycomb. There was so much effort involved, and we needed this sort of motivational drive, this motivational system to tell us, hey, putting in all of this effort to go and get these foods, it's going to be worth it. And even up until about 40 years ago, we lived in a food environment that looked very different. The foods that were at the grocery store were largely whole, nutritious foods that occur in nature, but sort of gone are the days of putting in this effort to get those foods when we live in this modern food environment where the foods are engineered in a way to make them highly rewarding, and our food environment is saturated with these foods in a way that actually makes it more difficult to avoid them than to actually go and seek them out. We're bombarded by advertisements every day. Every time you drive down the road, you see a McDonald's or a Starbucks or whatever is your kind of personal food environment that you're in. Grocery stores have aisles and aisles and advertisements full of these foods. So they're sort of everywhere in a way that makes them very cheap, accessible, and highly rewarding in a way that these foods never have been up until about 40 years ago.
And it's driven, let's be honest, it's driven by the desire to create wealth. And the reason I say that is this. Just this morning, Elisa, my wife, she says, did you hear there's now a new potato milk? We've got almond milk, we've got coconut milk, we've got all these substitutes for milk, which has been demonized for some reason. And now we have potato milk. And these are the epitome of processed foods, but somehow they get the label of being healthy because, you're lactose intolerant, so you can't enjoy milk. So we're going to give you an alternative. We're already seeing problems with people who consume a lot of almond milk because of the high oxalate content of almonds. We're already seeing this. It's been when people give up almond milk, mysteriously, the pains in their joints seem to go away. Now, what are we going to learn from potato milk? We're going to overconsume something that we would have consumed in small amounts, and we're gonna, it just baffles me, and it's all driven by someone to come out with a new product to capture wealth in the food industry. That's all it is.
Yeah, and often the companies that are selling these diet foods are the same companies that own the original version of the product. So whether they convince you to buy the original version of the product that's loaded with fats, carbohydrates, sugars, salts that make them highly rewarding, or they convince you to go with the diet option as part of a diet that you're on, and they advertise it as, hey, we switched out the sugars for this alternative, so it doesn't have these sugars. We made it low fat, adjusting one or two different ingredients in it. They rebranded as something that's healthy for you and going to support a healthy lifestyle. But then regardless of which one you end up consuming, they're winning behind the scenes.
Yeah. And again, processed foods. There was a study that looked at processed food consumption and fat in and around the heart. And it correlated to the higher processed food consumption. You had a higher probability of developing this very invasive, very harmful pro-inflammatory fat around the heart. And processed food, I mean, is 99% of the food that people eat today. It's processed. If it comes in a box and it has a bunch of ingredients, it didn't grow out of the ground, or it didn't come from an animal. It was processed, and the further away we get from processed food, it becomes boring to our palate. Number one, but more importantly, the healthier you will be. Just that one little change. I mean, people don't have to give up a whole lot if they just ate foods that either grew out of the ground naturally and minimal processing. You cut them up and cook them, or steak and chicken and fish and stuff like that, and eggs. I mean, it's just startling. How was your study designed?
Yeah, so our study was an MTurk study. So we collected data from participants all over the world through Amazon Mechanical MTurk's system that allows us to distribute questionnaires. We had 357 adult participants in our study. So they were self-reporting on their own consumption of substances, their own addictive risk to these highly processed foods, and they were self-reporting on problematic use in their parents as well. So it was all within these adult participants. We were very careful in the study to try to get this wide distribution of different body weights, different distributions of demographics, because we've seen some of the core limitations in the previous research has been that this food addiction work has been done primarily on samples who meet criteria for obesity, which we know that we see food addiction all across the spectrum. We estimate that about 14% of the population meets criteria for food addiction. And we see this in people of a normal body weight as well, where it's still associated with poorer outcomes, poor quality of life, in the same way that we see for individuals at a higher body weight. And we were also very careful to make sure that both men and women were included in this study, because previous research has primarily been done on women, where we know that the risk for addiction is actually higher in men. So only sampling from women may miss this important group. So we collected the sample of about 357 participants and essentially asked questionnaires about this so that we could look at the co-occurrence between meeting our criteria for food addiction, which is based off of the diagnostic criteria that's used for other substance use disorders, and comparing it to their self-reporting of their own use and the use of their parents as they reported themselves.
So really, whatever the substance of choice is, these people have an addictive behavior. And by addictive behavior, I'm saying you're doing something you shouldn't. It's impairing the quality of your life. It's impairing your relationships. It's impairing your health. But yet you won't abandon it. You'll defend it. Yeah. And so I would imagine that there's a stratification where, yeah, I don't abuse food, but I abuse coffee, and I'm saying that from somebody who's lived with that burden, and caffeine. Or yeah, I don't abuse food because I'm 64 years old. I'm in really good shape. Yeah. But I still have those addictive tendencies. I know I do. I've wrestled with them my whole life, but the substances are different.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that there are different underlying mechanisms that are associated kind of across these addictive substances. So higher rates of impulsivity, more difficulties with emotion regulation, higher reward sensitivity to environmental cues or like the consumption of these different substances. And we know that for example, with this parent data, that conference of that risk isn't necessarily substance specific. So a parent who has difficulties with alcohol may see an increase in difficulties with food or tobacco or some other substance in their children. So this really supports that idea of those underlying mechanisms that aren't specific to one substance, one type of food, but are more general difficulties with these personality characteristics or different traits that are more associated with difficulties with addiction. We tend to define addiction as intense cravings for the substance, difficulties with quitting use despite negative consequences. So those could be social, those could be health, medical consequences. For example, with food addiction, we often see highly processed foods associated with obesity, diabetes, heart disease, liver disease. So a lot of these medical conditions where one of the most well-supported interventions is a reduction in consumption of specific foods. With an addiction, we would see in this conceptualization difficulties associated with reduction in consumption of those foods, despite the fact that you could be very ill or potentially die from the conditions involved in consumption, very similarly to what we see with alcohol use and liver disease, or tobacco use and lung disease with other addictive substances. We'd also define addiction as you said, loss of control over the consumption and very difficulties in reducing that consumption because of that loss of control and because of those intense cravings. And yeah, so it makes it very, very challenging. It's particularly with food, considering the food environment that we're living in, considering the fact that these foods are being intentionally engineered in a way that makes them highly rewarding to our reward systems, and that they are so cheap, available, heavily marketed across our society.
When I was in college, I had quite a few anatomy and physiology classes, and I remember discussing clinical addiction. And clinical addiction is not just the outward behavior, the craving and so on, but we see changes in the brain. We see, in the case of nicotine or opioids, we see the region of the brain that is affected by the drug grows larger and more dense, so that the desire becomes stronger and physical, withdrawal, pain, discomfort, and for years I have sat in this chair for 16 years, going on 17. And when people would say, well, sugar is addictive, I'd correct them and say, no, it's not. It's habit forming. If it doesn't modify the brain by making those area of the brain grow and make them stronger on the impulses that they create, that is the salient characteristic of addiction. But I'm changing my opinion. And I really think that addiction needs to include changes in the gut, because the microbiome plays a very, very profound. In fact, I would stand to be corrected, but I would say that the microbiome is responsible for 85% of cravings, and it does this by certain microbes that are demanding to be fed, produce neuroactive chemicals that go right up the vagus nerve into the brain and say, hey, stop at that Starbucks because we want something that's in that coffee that's been feeding us all this time. And this is true of alcohol. I've proven to myself. I shared off the air with you the stories about the gentleman that I helped with LL37. He doesn't crave alcohol at all. But I think the definition of addiction needs to be modified and recognize that a lot of these urges and impulses are originating in the gut, and then being then influencing the brain. What do you think of that?
I think it's a really interesting point. I think that there's this sort of mentality that we're all out there searching for this one biomarker, this one thing that's going to be the gene or the brain region or the one kind of component that's going to say this equals addiction. And as far as I know, we haven't found anything out there that says, this one thing is an indicator that somebody's addicted, this one gene, this one biomarker. If there is something out there, I'd love to know what it is because I absolutely want to research it. And I think that the gut biome makes a lot of sense as one of these areas that we're looking at for potential indicators of predictors associated with increased risk for craving. I think it makes a lot of sense that if that's where our food is going, that's the part of us that's breaking down these foods. It's sending signals to the brain. We know that the gut and the brain are in constant communication about what's coming in, what's calorically needed for the body, what's going to help support it, that there may be components of the gut biome that are informing messages that are being sent to the brain. I think that from our perspective, we really do look for some of those behavioral indicators as well, really looking for, regardless of whether the signal's coming from the gut biome, the brain, we're seeing this loss of control over these foods. We're seeing these intense cravings that are being signaled by the body when we're exposed to these foods. And I think that gut biome makes sense as one of those potential indicators of where that signal's coming from.
And it seems that what we've done with metabolomics could take on this job of maybe I'm not sure that the nomenclature I'm using is appropriate, but the same way we radioisotope certain molecules and compounds and then follow them through the body and go, oh, look where they go, and if there's a way to follow the foods or the compounds that we know have these urge building behaviors, and then look and see if we can, through taxonomy, and look and see if we could catalog the microbes that seem to be the ones that are the most active in consuming them. And then and we could identify, like, okay, so when somebody has a high degree of these particular microbes in their gut, they tend to have alcohol cravings or sugar cravings or so on. I feel like we're getting there. We have companies like Viome now that are doing the work of cataloging the microbes in your gut, and we get our people like to say, well, we get our genes from our parents. Well, we get both seed microbes. If you were lucky enough to have a breastfeeding mother. If you weren't, then you picked up the microbes from the house and from the environment and from touching things and putting your fingers in your mouth. But we also get our primary microbiome from our family, and that environment is largely a result of what they eat. And then they feed you those foods, right? And, if you're Italian, your mother makes pasta or whatever, and it's almost like it's very hard for me to discern between the attributes of our being that we get from our DNA and what we get from the environment that our family raised us in.
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question for scientists, right? That complex interaction between the genetic or biocomponents. They're being passed along through evolutionary processes, the environmental components that may have impacts on those genes, that have impacts on our behaviors, and how those, as long as social factors, are all kind of interacting together to uniquely impact an individual's risk is so complex. And I agree, we've made amazing leaps in the technology that we have available to start to probe into some of these questions. And we absolutely have a long way to go in figuring out how to look at these complex interactions in a way that really informs our understanding of how our bodies are interacting with these foods, especially as our environment changes so much and makes it so much harder to interact with these foods in a way that we've never really experienced before.
I want to take our first commercial break. When we come back, I want to touch on epigenetics for a minute, because epigenetics deserves some time in this discussion, and get some ideas from you. We're talking with Lindsey Hoover. She has published this great study looking at really basically the transgenerational effects of addictive behaviors. And some people have it and some people don't. It's fascinating. And usually if their parents had it, they have it. And if their parents didn't have it, they don't have it. And we'll get into this a little bit deeper when we come back. Stay tuned. You are watching and listening to Superhuman Radio. We'll be right back. Are you suffering from signs of an unhappy gut? Diversity is the key to healthy, robust inner ecosystem. Body Ecology probiotic liquids are made by fermenting organic seeds, biodynamic brown rice, and chickpeas together to create a diverse culture found nowhere else on Earth. It's the secret to restoring your gut's microbiome for a healthier digestive tract, improved immune function, and longevity. Take 20% off by visiting the website shrnetwork.biz/bodyeco, shrnetwork.biz/bodyeco, that's BODYECO, and using the code SHR20. GHKCU is one of the most effective peptides for rebuilding more youthful skin, reversing skin damage, diminishing wrinkles, and tightening loose skin. I personally use Restoracell with GHKCU every day. It's making an undeniable difference in the quality of my skin. Restoracell is fantastic for all types of skin. Now you can order Restoracell and save 25% when you use the code SHR25. That's SHR25. While you may be diligent in your workouts and your diet, don't neglect what people see first and foremost, and that's your skin. Go to shrnetwork.biz/blue and use code SHR25 today. Remember those rectangular toasted pastries you used to love when you were a kid? Well, Legendary Foods has just made them better. The new cake-style tasty pastry is like nothing you've ever had before. With 20 grams of high-quality protein and less than 1 gram of sugar, you'll feel like you're cheating, but you're not. Go to shrnetwork.biz/legendary and use the code SHR10 to save 10% off your purchase of tasty pastries. Now available in cookies and cream, red velvet cake, birthday cake, blueberry, strawberry, brown sugar cinnamon, and hot fudge sundae. Go to shrnetwork.biz/legendary and use code SHR10 today. There have been no new innovations in men's underwear for hundreds of years. That's all about to change with Sheath. Sheath creates 2 separate compartments for your man stuff so it doesn't get smashed into a mound and sweaty and stinky. I won't wear any other underwear now that I've learned about Sheath, and you won't either. Go to shrnetwork.biz/Sheath underwear. That's SHEATHUNDERWEAR. Use code SUPERHUMAN to save 20% off. I promise you, once you try a pair of Sheath underwear, you will never wear anything else. Are you 35 or older? Every year after puberty, your growth hormone decreases sometimes by 50% by the age of 35, and it only keeps going down from there. wear. This affects everything from making it harder to recover from workouts, sleep, and a general loss of a sense of well-being. It also affects your ability to get and stay lean. BioPro Plus is the first of its kind, 100% non-synthetic alternative to prescription synthetic growth hormone treatments. All the benefits without any of the needles or side effects and 100% safe. Previously only available through doctors, you can go to shrnetwork.biz/biopro, that's BIOPRO, and use code SHR30 for $30 off today. The Hercules pre-workout from Lost Empire Herbs is like no pre-workout you have ever had before. Completely natural formula designed specifically to optimize workouts, provide quicker recovery time, provide adequate nutrition, and get you away from all those no-good, overstimulating pre-workout supplements on the market today. The Hercules pre-workout blend is a mix of extracted natural herbs and mineral pitch. No fake colors, no added flavors, nothing else. Not only will Hercules pre-workout formula help your workouts, but you'll likely discover lots and lots of side effects, beneficial side effects. Go to shrnetwork.biz/Lost Empire today to learn more.
Spit that out right now. This is the Superhuman Channel.
Welcome back. We're talking with Lindsey Hoover about this recent study that looks at addictive behavior that seems to be transgenerational. And I want to talk about epigenetics because a lot of people think of epigenetics just being something that affects your genes and your health, but intelligence is passed transgenerationally by way of epigenetics. And we've talked about it on this show. I don't think I need to do a primer for anybody. But it seems like maybe these addictive qualities could be some sort of epigenetic imprint that's passed on from generation to generation. Because I'm willing to bet. So my grandfather drank wine every day. My father's father, he used to drink when he retired. That's when I saw him. I was very young. But my aunt would put a shot in his coffee in the morning of Benedictine and brandy, and he would sip on Benedictine and brandy or wine throughout the day. Many of my uncles on both my maternal and paternal side had drinking problems. Got drunk, stumbled home and were drunk. I'm willing to bet that if I go back 3 generations further, I'm going to find some of the same behaviors. The alcohol abuse. My father was an alcoholic for a period of his life, and then he just quit cold turkey, which I commended him for when he was alive. It just seems so predictable that if you grow up in a household where this type of behavior takes place, then it's easy to because you have my sister didn't drink, you know what I mean, and she came from the same pool and the same genes and all that sort of stuff. So it seems to me that the behavior may have to be observed as part of the indoctrination and sort of the priming, the kickoff. And then you kind of know what to do because it's programmed into you. You just start abusing things.
I think that this is one of those big questions that scientists are certainly still grappling with, the complex interaction of all of these different components of environmental factors, like the environment that you grow up in, the modeled behavior that you see, daily lifestyle sort of factors, stressors on the household, as well as these genetic components that we know from an evolutionary perspective can get passed down transgenerationally. I think I certainly hesitate to contribute a large amount of it to any one thing. And I think that scientists are still really grappling with that question of how much are each of these different potential components contributing to increased risk in offspring. What we do know from the addiction perspective, however, is that however this risk is getting transferred through environmental factors, through those genetic components, through neural correlates that are common between the parent and the child, that this family history component is one of our strongest predictors across substance use disorders for that risk in their offspring. So yeah, I definitely think that epigenetics is one of those important questions that we should be continuing to question and look at how those complex interactions are occurring for each individual's unique risk regarding these different substances.
So, and Craig Hollander points something out that I've talked about on this show for quite a long time, and I use Russia and Ireland as examples of this. You know, even trauma is passed down generationally. Has science proven it? A growing body of research. I don't need science to prove it. Alcoholism and depression rates in populations who have experienced real famine. I'm not talking about, I mean, real famine where they were picking people up off the streets and eating them, display a high degree of alcoholism, higher degree of alcoholism and depression than general populations. We see this both in Russia and we see this in Ireland. Again, these are intelligence is also passed down through epigenetic messaging transgenerationally, and it's all part of evolution. It's if every generation started from scratch, you know what I mean, we would be starting over. It'd be Groundhog Day every new generation, but we don't. We leap from the shoulders of those who preceded us, and a lot of that is imparted upon our offspring epigenetically. So I get it, but I wonder if trauma plays a role in the abusive behaviors. Is what I really wanted to ask. Do we find that those who have these types of behaviors, overeating, you know, you always hear about the young girl who got raped and then she just put on as much weight as she could because she wanted to keep the world away, or so. You know, does trauma contribute to addiction?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a lot of research out there that shows strong associations between a history of trauma and increased uses of substances. There's a lot of theories about that being through mechanisms of coping, of emotion regulation, but we do see that pretty strong association with trauma and substance use disorders broadly. I actually recently published a paper on the association between childhood trauma and food addiction specifically, and we found, similar to traditional substance use disorders, that there was an increased, there was a higher association between experiencing childhood trauma and risk for food addiction through emotion dysregulation sort of mechanisms. And we saw that men in particular were actually at a significantly increased risk for this, which is pretty striking findings when we think, as I've said, with this study that we're talking about today, the lack of men being included in a lot of the research that we've been doing. But all of that to say, yes, absolutely. There's evidence that suggests that trauma is one of those factors that is associated with an increased risk of food addiction as well as other substance use disorders.
Did anything show up in this study that surprised you, that you didn't expect to see?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the current study, I think that one of the most surprising findings to me was that when we looked at those participants who had a history of parental problematic use, the risk ratio that we found, so the increased risk of having food addiction, was higher than any other substance that we looked at in the study. So the risk of food addiction was actually the same, if not higher, than risk of personal alcohol use when you had a parent who had problematic alcohol use. And that just seems striking because you think that if you have a parent with problematic alcohol use, that the highest association would be with your own alcohol use, with that conference of the same substance. But when you see that these numbers for food addiction are actually appearing the same, if not higher, it's pretty compelling evidence for the risk associated with these highly processed foods. We have some hypotheses, of course, about why we found those. One of those being that if you know you have a family history of problematic use of a substance, there's a lot more ability to avoid those substances. Many people never consume them in their lives if they know they have that risk. You're able to more modify your environment more easily to be able to avoid risks of those substances or avoid specific substances. However, often we're exposed to these highly processed foods within the first year or two of life. They're a part of the American diet. They're saturating our environment. And as we've already talked about, it's very, very challenging to avoid these foods and to not consume them. So that early childhood exposure, when your brain is still developing, when your diet isn't completely in your control, and the fact that essentially the entire population is exposed to these foods at some point may be a factor contributing to those higher rates that we see compared to the other substances that we looked at in this study.
And we can't ignore the fact that people are bombarded with messages to eat food, these crap foods, constantly through TV and radio and podcasts and I mean, it's like, I was thinking when you were saying, yeah, I get it. Like, if your father was an alcoholic, you can choose, like, because of his behavior, you want to level up your generation. I'm going to level up. I'm not going to be like my dad. But food isn't stigmatized like alcohol or drugs. And then when you take into account that you're receiving probably 1,000 messages a day to eat Hot Pockets and other crap food, and we can't ignore that. We can't ignore the push of modern advertising contributing to this problem. And I know people say whenever you have these kind of discussions, like, well, they can turn the TV off, or we're not making them do it. And I get it, but if you already lean into the addiction or abuse wind, and now you have this wind at your back, pushing you even further. It's like it's really a very, very difficult fight to win within yourself.
Yeah. And I mean, sure, maybe you can turn off the TV, but if you walk outside your door, there are billboards and there are restaurants and there are newspapers and magazines, and the marketing is really just saturating our environment. And we know from thinking back to other addictions that we've seen in the past, like the tobacco, cigarette use in the past, advertising to children is one of the most impactful public health prevention measures that we've taken. And there are essentially no limitations on advertisement, sales, increases in taxation. None of these strategies are currently being used for highly processed foods that have been most impactful to reducing the negative consequences of different substances that we've seen being highly problematic in the past, like cigarettes or alcohol.
And when they took advertisements of cigarettes off TV, and they took them out of the movies, they said, actors can't portray cigarettes. It had an impact. It had an impact. About 10 years after those took place, new smokers were down. And even today, we still have people in certain populations, especially Asian and Middle Eastern, smoking. But by and large, tobacco sales are down, and they've shifted to, what do they call them? Smokeless tobacco. That's kind of like a cool thing. But it has an impact. The advertising had an impact on tobacco use, and it would have an impact on the fast food and garbage food industry if we could rein in the advertising.
Absolutely. Tobacco the restrictions have been one of the most successful public health interventions ever in our society. And what many people don't realize is that those companies who own the tobacco industry, the big name cigarettes and tobacco companies, are owners of many of the highly processed food industries as well. And they're using that same playbook that they've used with tobacco products for the engineering, the advertisement, the sales of these highly processed foods, which again makes it so challenging for the individual that wants to take care of themselves when they're fighting against this entire industry that's setting up our food environment in a way that makes it nearly impossible for the individual to avoid those foods if they wanted to.
It's funny. I'm thinking while you're talking, which is the sign of a bad host, by the way. But and I'm thinking, this is really disgusting. It's like the pursuit of money, and and they know what they're doing because they're putting people's health at risk, but they know that their products, their food products, once you eat one, you want a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth. And I know a man who put that science to good use for good. My friend Ron Penna, who is one of the founders of Quest Nutrition. You remember the Quest bars?
Mm-hmm.
He hired a guy who worked for the food industry to understand what makes people want to eat something. And he used that science on healthy things, the Quest bar, 20 grams of protein, less than, 1 gram of sugar. And Legendary Foods is his new company. So he has harnessed this science for good, for the good of mankind, to like get people to eat more of healthy things instead of crap things. So it can be done. But I don't think that the average food company out there, the Procter and Gamble's and all that sort of stuff, care about that. In fact, I know Procter and Gamble doesn't care about it because they knew Crisco was bad when they introduced it in the 1900s, and they just buried all the science that showed that it was bad, and they kept selling it. And 50 years later, hydrogenated oil, oh yeah, it's no good for you. A lot of lives was sacrificed because Dr. Paul Dudley White, who was the co-founder of the American Heart Association, wrote a position paper in 1924 saying of this new hydrogenated vegetable or seed oil, he said, abandon it. He said that the rate of myocardial infarctions, heart attack, has tripled and quadrupled since it's been used. And he blamed that. He said, go back to beef tallow, go back to lard, go back to natural oils. But that was pushed under the rug. That Procter and Gamble wasn't going to let that news get out there, and they pushed it under the rug. And here we are, decades later, going, "Oh, this was bad for us all this time." They just covered it up. So, it's really evil. People, we're genetically predisposed to need food, crave food, and they use that science to feed us crap. And look at the burden of health that we have today to deal with.
And unfortunately, the messaging is often that it's the individual's responsibility to not consume these foods, which is the playbook, again, that we've seen for other addictive substances in the past when, tobacco, cigarettes were really getting pushed out there. The messaging prior to some of these interventions was, well, then just don't smoke. Stay away from these substances.
Yeah, just don't do it. Yeah.
And that's often the messaging around junk food as well, saying the individual needs to stay away. But just like these other addictive foods, the environment and the foods are engineered in a way that makes that very difficult. And I argue that there's too much blame a lot of the times on the individual, and really we need to be looking at the industry and asking, what is going on with the marketing, what is going on with the rewarding nature of these foods, and shine a little bit more light on the role of the industry in the problematic consumption of these foods.
Yeah. I want to take our last commercial break, and then we'll wrap up the interview. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with more. I would easily say that I am the hugest proponent you will ever meet to doing anything that will improve the quality of my sleep. And that's because sleep is linked to just about every metabolic disorder we see in our population today. One of the easiest things you can do to improve the quality of your sleep is to get a pillow that can be shaped into the exact form factor that allows you to get your best night's sleep. And that is MyPillow. I've been sleeping with MyPillow for a few years now, and I can tell you that when I have to travel and stay in hotels, I don't get a good night's sleep because I don't have MyPillow with me. Right now, you can save up to 60% off of everything offered to improve the quality of your sleep at shrnetwork.biz/mypillow when you use the code SHR. Or you can call toll-free 800-889-4938. And remember to use code SHR to save up to 60% off of everything at their website. Never before has a product been so appropriately named as Botanic Tonics Feel Free. This plant-based elixir combines a variety of different effective compounds, all from raw plant materials that at different different doses provide you with completely different experiences. A third of a bottle puts you in the zone and makes you very focused and is ideal for a non-stimulating pre-workout. It also has a mild analgesic effect for us older lifters who have soreness and little pains and aches that keep us from training as ferociously as we want. A half a bottle will create a mild euphoric effect that will allow you to forego consuming alcohol but still be socially lubricated and have fun. I have never had a product deliver on its name the way Botanic Tonics Feel Free does, and I won't ever be without it, and you shouldn't either. Go to shrnetwork.biz/feelfree and use the code SHR40 for 40% off your first order. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. Being superhuman means being conscientious about the choices we make. White Oak Pastures is superhuman when it comes to raising livestock. They're committed to animal welfare, land regeneration, and rural revival. They responsibly manage the entire process from the pasture to your doorstep. High-quality, pasture-raised, great-tasting meat from a farm you can trust. Full nose-to-tail selections. They even have options for your pet. Go to shrnetwork.biz/whiteoak and use the code SUPERHUMAN to save 10% off your entire first order.
Dogs should be powered by fat and protein, not carbs. That's why Visionary Pet makes low-carb, ketogenic dog food for dogs of all breeds and life stages. From kibble to freeze-dried and even low-carb treats, all Visionary Pet recipes are very low-carb, ketogenic, and made with 100% real meat protein. Shop now and use code SHR for 20% off your first order today. Your dog deserves the lifelong benefits of optimal nutrition. Make the switch to Visionary and see why smart dogs eat low carb.
P3OM from Bioptimizers is a patented prebiotic and probiotic supplement with Lactobacillus plantarum OM. It has now been upgraded to P3OM 2.0 with the addition of a superfood formulation that makes it 2 times stronger, as well as optimizes L. plantarum's strength. So it's more powerful than ever, which means that not only will it help you completely digest all animal proteins, it also reduces cortisol, causes deep relaxation and better sleep, and reduces stress. Go to shrnetwork.biz/P3-OM today and use the code SHR10 to save 10% off.
New Mass Pro Synthogen X2 just upped its own legendary game. To distance itself even further from the rest of the pack, Synthogen X2 now has double the key active ingredients. If you've ever wondered what steroid-like recovery feels like, Synthogen X2 delivers. See why others compare it favorably to powerful bodybuilding drugs at synthogen.com. Mass Pro Synthogen. When you train with it, you'll gain with it.
Move over, superheroes. This is the Superhuman Channel.
Welcome back. So, Lindsey, this study, I mean, what do you hope clinicians and lay people will take away from it? What usable guidance can we take away from this research?
Yeah, so I think that the first thing is that this study really suggests that some of those risk factors that we see in traditional substance use disorders, like co-occurrence with other problematic substance use, like a familial history, also seem to apply to this concept of food addiction. There seems to be this support or this growing evidence for the idea that these foods can be addictive in similar ways to other substances that we traditionally think of. From a clinician's perspective, that may suggest that when we're doing screenings for substance use disorders, when we're seeing clients for eating-related difficulties, that we may need to consider these sort of in tandem and consider the potential overlap where we're conceptualizing our treatments both for the potential addictive consumption of highly processed foods and substances, that we're considering screenings between crossing diagnoses and incorporating that into our conceptualization of these clinical presentations for the individual. I also think that it's really important to consider that we're living in a really challenging environment, that we're living in this environment that's making it very, very difficult to interact with these foods. So I'd encourage all individuals as well as clinicians when talking to their clients to incorporate that level of self-compassion into the way that we're conceptualizing our relationships with these foods, understanding that there is something about these foods that's making them highly rewarding and making them very difficult to engage in, and showing ourselves that compassion around the consumption of these foods. And considering how we're setting up our individual food environments, those spaces that we do have control over when we are trying to do something to help ourselves as much as we can in this challenging environment. So the last thing I want to encourage is sort of white knuckle restriction. I can say I eat pizza, I eat ice cream, I engage with these foods, but viewing them in this way, considering your individual risk and considering which foods are most risky for you. We know that hunger is associated with increased cravings for these foods. So being hungry all of the time, restricting our eating all the time surrounding these foods can actually make it more difficult to engage with them. So having snacks on hand that we like, that we can also engage in a way that doesn't lead to binging on these foods, lead to overconsumption, and setting up our environments with some of that planning and some of that forethought that may be necessary to have safer snacks on hand and to have other options in our environment that may make engaging with foods in our environment a little bit easier.
First of all, I used to be 330 pounds. Okay, I was morbidly obese. And two things that helped me a great deal, and that is, don't bring things into your home that you crave, that because if you have to get in your car and go get something, you're more likely to pass on it. And so you have to be strong when you go shopping, not to buy those things, and because you'll convince yourself, I'll eat one. I mean, I can just eat one, and that doesn't go well. And the other thing is, believe it or not, peppermint or some sort of spearmint chewing gum. When I lost a total of 100 pounds when I started this journey. I was just turned 40. I'm 64 now, and so. Chewing gum saved my life. There were so many times where I wanted to eat something that it could have been that I had eaten already and I wanted to wait 2.5 to 3 hours before I ate again, and I didn't have the willpower to do it. Or it could be that I was eating and I finished my meal and I was wanting more. Throwing a piece of chewing gum in your mouth, spearmint, mint flavors are the best, or brushing your teeth, quite frankly, will work too. It changes your perspective on your hunger, and because first of all, mint flavors are so competitive with other flavors that a lot of times once you eat something like that, what you wanted to eat to begin with would taste horrible now following that. And then the other thing was, it shifts your desire to eat more, because the peppermint, the mint flavor is so strong. And I can tell you that was a key secret of mine, losing 100 pounds, was I threw a piece of chewing gum in my mouth to punctuate every meal, because that signified I was done and I wasn't going to eat something else. And I kept chewing gum handy when I felt like I'm going to cave in, I need to eat something, and I would throw a piece of chewing gum. And these kind of strategies you have to employ, because obviously your brain wants what it wants, and it's like a child. You have to divert its attention. Diversions are the way you keep young, unruly children in line. It's not shouting at them and threatening to spank them. They want something, they're fixated on, they're about to throw a tantrum, and all you have to do is just make a difference. Oh, look at that. What is that over there? And the kid looks and quiets down, stops crying immediately. He's looking for what you're looking at. So you have to divert your brain from wanting that food, and chewing gum is magic. It's magic for that. So that's my contribution. Yeah, Taylor C says brushing your teeth. He said brushing your teeth and tongue scraping helps with cravings. So there you go. I think we've covered everything. Was there anything that we missed?
I think that covers it. Thank you so much for having me. I love being able to talk about this. I think it's such an important topic and something that people always don't have all of the information about. So I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about my paper and discuss what it's like living in this challenging environment.
Yeah, thank you. And you're welcome back. Next time you publish a paper, just get in touch with Elisa and she'll get you booked, okay?
Thank you so much.
Take care. And that's it for today. We have Dr. Sean Baker on tomorrow. We have a special time because he couldn't be here for 1 o'clock. But he's going to talk about a study that I found that claims that producing plant-based meats is better for the environment, and it's not. The whole plant-based meat industry is crumbling right before our eyes. It was such a poor seller that all the fast food restaurants have pulled it now. It's a silly product, and let's not forget, it's processed food. No matter how you slice it, it's processed food. So he's going to come on tomorrow at 2 o'clock, so don't miss that. We are banned from YouTube for a few more days because I did a show where I had a guest on. A group of doctors is putting on an event in St. Louis, and apparently there's a couple physicians who were supposedly giving medical misinformation during COVID that will be at that event. And just because I let them advertise on the show, I got banned for spreading medical misinformation on YouTube. So we will be back on YouTube in a few more days. So those of you who watch on YouTube will be back, and we'll put all the old shows, all the shows that didn't air live will be up there. So even this one. But yeah, it's still going on YouTube. They're still censoring people. It's crazy. All right, look, we'll see you tomorrow with more Superhuman Radio. Please share the show. And remember, muscle is metabolic currency. So get into the gym and make a deposit today. We'll see you tomorrow.